Hi guys, so this is my second time filming this theory presentation. The first time got filmed in slow-mo, so it turned into like a 30-minute video of me talking very slow. Um, but for this theory presentation, I decided to talk about conflict theory, and this is what I talked about on my last social theory paper. I focused on social conflict theory, and more specifically, how that affects or how it's shown about the gangs in Chicago. In my own words, I describe conflict theory as an idea that is generated to prove the disruption between two classes due to a disproportionate allocation of resources. And this theory focuses on the inequalities of a society that causes clashes between basically the haves and have-nots. And this was first explained by Karl Marx in his example of the bourgeoisie and the proletariats. In short, the bourgeoisie were kind of that 1% where they had all the money and they ran the means of production that the proletariat worked for. And again, the proletariat were the working class and oftentimes the majority. But as far as terms of power, the bourgeoisie had more power. Karl Marx also went on to explain that within conflict theory, there also comes a time where there may be some sort of overturning of power or revolution, which oftentimes creates this cycle of conflict where it's kind of never ending. Whereas if you look at something like functionalism, there is some sort of resolution. Although with conflict theory, say for instance the proletariat overpower the bourgeoisie, then at that standpoint the bourgeoisie are now trying to take back their power, so again conflict arises. So it is that kind of never ending cycle. Amongst that, that's kind of why people do the things that they do within conflict. People are always searching for power and should try to get ahead. And I think that is just a natural human instinct if you look at kind of just the epistemology of why people involve themselves in conflict or just naturally are in that sort of environment where conflict is apparent. And we all live through different conflicts. They may be small, they may be large, and can be examined through many different lenses. The main concepts that are associated with oftentimes with conflict theory is Marxism, and we had a long conversation about that in this class, just about Marxism alone, and oftentimes there's that communist perspective that comes into play when talking about anything with Karl Marx. Some people agree with it, some people don't, just with the whole socialist perspective. Also that comes into play with this is often social class, and just kind of the division of power with amongst social classes. There's that oppressed and the oppressee. Some people that stand out obviously are Karl Marx. He generated the theory of conflict theory, and then there was many other predecessors. One of the more important ones would be Max Weber. He focused on the economics of the conflict theory and how oftentimes there is conflict in economics, and I will talk more about that with the gang violence in Chicago. And then he also focused on more like a political power as well as social structures. So he kind of just extended the social theory in more of a modern perspective. As far as disciplinary standpoints of this theory, it's oftentimes looked at a macro level, and oftentimes that's one of the criticisms, that it is often only looked at a macro level, although I found when writing my paper I could write it at a meso as well as micro level. I don't know how well I argued that, but I feel like it definitely can be argued at a individual level as well. Another strength of the conflict theory is it's widely used in social work. It's oftentimes why people need social work, is there's a conflict between two sides, and something needs to get fixed. So I think it's really important to learn about conflict theory and all the aspects that go into it, and I definitely think it can be expanded upon. In regards to kind of how it relates to my paper and the gang violence in Chicago, I mean, gang violence can be tracked all the way back. You can look at it from the time of the 20s, where there's a Prohibition era, and Al Capone and their gangs, like such as those, and organized crime. Though more recently it has been more modernized, and there are specific oppressed people who are in gangs, and it's largely become more of an issue within this last decade, just due to many things that Chicago has been going through. So Chicago has a population problem, for one. Many have left Chicago area. Many of the middle class have left the Chicago area, thus leaving many businesses and just kind of distorting the economics of the big city. I think it was over 200,000 people have left within the last decade. So that is a large outpouring of people that have left the city. Also, there are many other structural aspects of the economics that have caused these certain neighborhoods that where gang violence is prevalent, with a lack of the allocation of resources. So gang violence you can mainly see in Chicago is on the south side and west side of the town. Mainly these neighborhoods are people of color, mainly African American and Black people, and then you get your Hispanic gangs and Latino gangs as well. The largest ones are often ran by African Americans, and then this is due just to simply their fight for power. The economics have led in Chicago to a lack of law enforcement. Just the rate in which police are retiring, they cannot withstand with the higher rate. So there's about a lack of about 1,000 law enforcement officers in Chicago alone. With that, also just the poverty and the economics of that has left. With poverty, there's always going to be some sort of crime, violence, and drug usage, and all of those together have caused the gang violence in Chicago, with their need to find power somehow. And conflict theory is apparent in multiple ways that I have examined in my paper. The one is the gangs versus the city of Chicago, and how they are being dealt with. Many people are taking it upon themselves to deal with many of the situations in the gang life, and rather than going to law enforcement and dealing with the courts. And that has been a big struggle on the death rate in Chicago. There has been over 3,500 shootings reported just this year alone, and I believe 627 of those have resulted in a homicidal death. And then there's the conflict between gangs. So this conflict is a conflict between resources, territory, and really just kind of having that name of being, that gang that everyone wants to be a part of. And that's big part of the gang life is the recruitment from other gangs, just in their neighborhood alone, or children in the neighborhoods. And so there are about 66 gangs in Chicago right now, active gangs in Chicago, and many of those are rivalry gangs, so they're fighting against each other. And yeah, so I think it's really important to acknowledge how many different levels gang violence is prevalent, and I think it can be examined not only on a macro level, but on a micro level with the individual as well, and wanting to be a part of the gang life. And it's often kind of not a choice, it's just what people are born into. So I had a really great time learning about this, and I hope to use it in my future social work career.